Human offered his voice to steady an alien girl's fear. Her reply was softer than the night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main characters. The cold winds whipped through the desolate landscape of the alien planet, where the air was thin and filled with the scent of ice and dust. The sky, a deep shade of violet, stretched above in a constant twilight, casting long shadows across the barren plains. It was here, in this harsh and unforgiving environment, that Jake Anderson found himself standing in front of an alien girl. Her name was Lyrathia, and she was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Her skin was a deep shade of emerald green, smooth and shimmering under the fading light, and her large, glowing eyes flickered with uncertainty and fear. She was standing alone, her small form barely visible against the icy backdrop. Jake could see her shivering despite the heavy cloak draped around her. He had been assigned to this mission on the far reaches of space, a simple task to observe and report, but he never expected to find himself face to face with someone like her. As he approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the frozen ground, Lyrathia flinched, her wide eyes darting toward him as if expecting danger. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jake's steady voice broke through it, soothing and calm. Hey, you're all right. I'm not here to hurt you. He paused, taking another step closer, trying to offer her comfort without overwhelming her. I know it's cold, but I'm here to help. Lyrathia hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly, her posture stiff with apprehension. She had heard too many stories about humans, none of them kind. She had been taught to distrust them, to fear them. But there was something different about this one. His voice, though firm, was kind, something that she had never expected from a human. You won't hurt me? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, laced with doubt. Jake smiled gently, the warmth in his expression softening the harshness of the world around them. No, I won't. I promise. There was a long pause as Lyrathia searched his face, trying to read his intentions. She had been alone for so long, forced to survive in the cold, and the fear that had built up within her had made her wary of everyone. But Jake's steady presence, his calm demeanor, seemed to ease some of that fear. Slowly, she exhaled, her tense body relaxing just a little, though her guard remained up. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice shaky, yet there was a softness to it that wasn't there before. Jake took another step closer, lowering his tone even further. Nothing really. Just to make sure you're safe, he replied. It's not safe here, and I can't just leave you alone. He could tell that she wanted to resist, that pride and past experiences held her back from fully trusting him. But something in his voice, something in his words, gave her a fleeting sense of hope. Lyrathia looked down at the icy ground, her breath visible in the cold air, and for a moment, she considered turning away, continuing on her lonely path. But then, something in her softened, like the night sky slowly giving way to the first light of dawn. You really don't want anything? She asked, her voice barely audible now, but with a trace of something like longing, something she had buried deep within herself for so long. Jake shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. No, just to help. The warmth in his words seemed to melt away some of the walls she had built up over the years. Lyrathia took a deep breath, her body now more relaxed, though still cautious. I don't know what to say, she murmured, her voice softer than it had been before, like the quiet rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. Jake stepped even closer now, his tone still soft but steady. You don't have to say anything. Just trust me, and we'll get through this together. The world around them seemed to fade into the background as their eyes locked, a brief moment of understanding passing between them. It was in that brief exchange that Lyrathia realized she didn't have to face this harsh world alone anymore. And it was in that moment that Jake knew, without a doubt, that he had done the right thing, that helping her was the one thing that truly mattered in that moment. I feel the warmth of his voice, and it feels like the sun, something I haven't felt in a long time, Lyrathia thought, standing still in the cold as Jake's words slowly settled over her. His voice, steady and reassuring, was the only thing that felt real in a world that had long since ceased to make sense. She looked at him again, this time with less suspicion and more curiosity. He had offered her kindness without expecting anything in return, something she wasn't used to from her kind, let alone a human. A strange sense of safety crept over her as she stepped closer to him, feeling the heat of his presence in the icy air. It wasn't long before she found herself looking into his eyes again, this time with a sense of trust that she hadn't realized was building. "I'm not used to this," she murmured, almost to herself. Jake smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the same empathy that had drawn him to her in the first place. "I know," he said, his voice low but clear, "but it's not a bad thing." There was a long pause as the wind howled in the distance, the only sound between them. Lyrathia closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the tranquility of the moment. It felt strange to be so vulnerable, yet so safe at the same time. She had spent so much of her life building walls, guarding herself from the harshness of the world. But here, with Jake, it felt as though the walls were slowly crumbling, and for the first time in a long time, she could breathe. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're welcome," Jake replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "We're in this together now." The words hung in the air between them, and Lyrathia could feel the sincerity in them. There was no doubt in her mind that Jake meant what he said. He was willing to stand by her, no matter the dangers or difficulties they might face. The thought comforted her, more than she ever thought possible. "I don't know if I can do this," Lyrathia admitted, her voice trembling slightly as the weight of everything hit her. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Jake shook his head, his expression softening. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said gently. "It's okay to be scared. It's okay to need help." His words felt like a balm to her wounded soul. For so long, she had carried the burden of her own strength, feeling as though she couldn't afford to show any weakness. But Jake was right. She didn't have to be strong all the time. In that moment, Lyrathia let go of the fear that had been eating away at her for so long. She allowed herself to feel the comfort of Jake's presence, the warmth of his voice, and the reassurance that she didn't have to face everything alone. Together, they would face whatever came next. As the sun began to set behind them, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, Lyrathia took a step forward, no longer hesitant. With Jake by her side, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that, for once, she had someone who would stand with her. "I don't know how long we can stay out here," Jake said, his voice filled with quiet determination, but Lyrathia could hear the edge of concern in it. The cold had started to seep deeper into their bones, the freezing wind blowing harder as the sun dipped lower behind the horizon. It would be dark soon, and the harsh reality of the alien world around them would return. They had already walked for hours, Jake leading the way with Lyrathia trailing behind him. She had offered to take the lead several times, but each time, Jake would shake his head, his eyes soft but firm. "You don't know this world like I do," he had said, his confidence in the unknown somehow reassuring. Lyrathia glanced at him as they moved, her thoughts tangled. There was something about him that made her feel protected, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She was used to being alone, forced to rely only on herself, her instincts and abilities, never allowing anyone close enough to be a real part of her world. But Jake was different. His actions, his kindness, made her feel like she could actually trust him, something she didn't expect from someone so completely different. "I've never met a human like you," Lyrathia said quietly, her voice barely louder than the wind. Jake looked back at her, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked, slowing his pace. Lyrathia felt a strange warmth spread across her chest as she met his gaze. You don't see me as just a creature. You don't look at me like others do." Her words were hesitant, but there was truth in them. Humans were usually afraid of her kind, or at best, they saw her as a curiosity, something to be studied or avoided. But Jake had not reacted that way. He had seen her as just another person, maybe even a friend. "That's because I don't see you as different," Jake said, his tone steady. "I see you as a person, a strong person who's been through a lot. But that doesn't mean you can't have someone who's willing to help." Lyrathia smiled slightly, the edges of her lips pulling upwards in a way that surprised her. She hadn't smiled in so long, and she didn't expect it to feel so natural. They continued walking in silence for a while, but this time, it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that settled over two people who had begun to understand one another. She felt herself relax, her body less tense with the presence of Jake beside her. "How much farther?" Lirathia asked after a while, looking ahead into the deepening dusk. "Not far," Jake replied, his voice still calm, but there was a hint of urgency now. "We need to find shelter before the storm picks up. This wind is going to get worse before it gets better." As if on cue, the wind howled louder, a biting cold that cut through their clothes, and the sky darkened, the stars above already hidden by thick clouds. They quickened their pace, the ground beneath them turning into a slick, icy surface. Jake looked over at Lirathia, concern etched on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, but with a firmness that made her feel like he genuinely cared. She nodded, though she could feel the fatigue creeping in. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly from the cold. Jake glanced at her again, his eyes searching, before he stepped forward, moving closer to her. "We'll be there soon," he said, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture that surprised them both. Lirathia glanced at him, her heart beating a little faster. She had never been so close to another being, human or otherwise, and the simple touch felt strangely comforting. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Lirathia could see the sincerity in his gaze. She couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward him, an unexpected connection that was growing stronger with each passing moment. They continued to move forward, step by step, towards the unknown shelter Jake had promised. And for the first time in a long while, Lirathia felt like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. "I can't believe we're still standing," Jake said softly, his breath clouding in the freezing air. They had finally reached shelter, a small, abandoned structure that had somehow withstood the harsh winds of the planet. The roof was barely intact, but it provided enough cover to keep them out of the worst of the storm. Inside, the temperature was only marginally better, but at least they were out of the wind. Jake dropped to the floor, leaning against the wall, his exhaustion starting to settle in. Lirathia, though still a little shaky, found herself sitting beside him. She could feel the warmth from his body, and for the first time that day, she felt herself truly relax. The storm outside raged on, but here, inside the structure, there was a rare moment of peace. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice low but sincere. Lirathia nodded, though her body still felt tense. She had been in dangerous situations before, but none like this. None with someone who genuinely seemed to care. "I am now," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt a strange warmth spread through her chest as she looked at him. She wasn't used to this feeling: vulnerability, trust, hope. She had built walls around herself for so long, but Jake was slowly, gently, breaking them down. "I don't know what to say," Lirathia admitted after a moment, her eyes avoiding his. "You don't have to say anything," Jake said, his voice reassuring. "Just relax. You're safe here." She looked over at him, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. There was a softness in his gaze, an understanding that she hadn't expected. She didn't know how long they sat there in silence, the only sound the distant howling of the storm. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. For once, it felt right. "Thank you," Lirathia said, her voice small but filled with sincerity. "For everything." Jake smiled, a small, tired smile. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what feels right." They stayed like that for a while, the night stretching on, but neither of them felt the need to speak. In that quiet, shared moment, Lirathia felt something stir within her. She had never been this open with anyone, human or otherwise. But Jake made it feel easy. It felt natural. And though the world outside was cold and uncertain, here, in this moment, she felt something that she had almost forgotten existed: hope. After some time, Jake stood up, stretching his arms above his head. "We'll rest here for the night. In the morning, we'll figure out what to do next." Lirathia nodded, her heart heavy with gratitude. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone. They were in this together. As she closed her eyes and let herself relax against the cold wall of the shelter, She found herself drifting off to sleep, the warmth of Jake's presence still lingering in the air, a reminder that, for once, everything might just be okay. The morning light broke through the small cracks in the shelter, casting a pale glow over the cold, still air. Jake had been awake for a while, silently observing the storm outside, which had finally started to lose its intensity. Lirithia, still asleep, lay curled up on the floor against the wall. Despite the harsh environment, she looked peaceful, the tension from the previous day finally fading. Jake knew it wouldn't be long before they had to leave the shelter and continue on their journey. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he was certain of one thing: they would face it together. He stood up slowly, his muscles stiff from the cold, and walked over to the small window, peering out at the snowy wasteland that stretched out before them. The wind had calmed, and the sun, though weak, had started to peek through the thick clouds. It would be a while before they reached any kind of civilization, and the thought of the long journey ahead made Jake's heart heavy. He knew Lirithia was still fragile, her mind torn between fear and hope, but there was a strength in her that he had come to admire. He turned away from the window and knelt beside her, gently shaking her awake. "Lirithia," he whispered softly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she looked disoriented, her mind slowly returning to the present. She blinked a few times, focusing on Jake's face. "We need to get moving," he said, offering her a hand. Lirithia looked at his outstretched arm, her gaze soft, but her eyes still held that lingering doubt. She had been through so much, and trusting another person, especially a human, had never come easy. But Jake had proven himself, time and time again. She reached up, taking his hand, and allowed him to help her to her feet. The cold hit her instantly, the air outside the shelter far more biting than inside. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly. Jake grabbed his bag and moved to the door, checking the outside before opening it. "It's safe for now," he said, stepping outside. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they began their journey once again. The sky had lightened, but the landscape was still a stark white, the horizon stretching endlessly in all directions. Lirithia could feel the unease creeping back in, but this time, it was different. She wasn't alone. Jake was here, and for the first time, she didn't feel quite so vulnerable. She could feel his presence beside her, steady and constant, like an anchor in the chaos of the world around them. The journey ahead was uncertain, but with Jake by her side, it felt like they could face whatever came next. As they walked, the silence between them was comfortable. No more words needed to be spoken. They both knew what was at stake and what they had to do. It was a simple truth that bound them: survival. But Lirithia also knew there was something more. Jake had shown her kindness when she least expected it, and in return, she felt something stir within her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Trust. A fragile, fleeting trust, but trust nonetheless. She glanced over at him as they walked side by side. "Jake," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "thank you for everything." He glanced at her, his face softening. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "I'm just doing what I think is right. We'll get through this." Lirithia nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time in a long time, she believed him. They continued walking, step by step, toward an uncertain future, but with each step, Lirithia felt a little more hopeful, a little less afraid. "And maybe that was enough for now. I don't know how much further we can go," Jake said, his breath coming out in short puffs as he trudged through the snow, glancing over at Lirithia. The world around them was a blur of white, the wind picking up again, biting at their skin. The storm had subsided, but the harsh cold was relentless. They had been walking for hours now, and the exhaustion was beginning to settle in. "We need to find shelter before the night hits again," he continued, his voice low but determined. Lirithia, walking beside him, nodded without saying anything. She was feeling the fatigue too, her limbs heavy, but her mind, for once, was clear. She was no longer afraid of the cold or the isolation. With Jake at her side, she felt like she could face anything, even the unknown. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that comes with understanding. They didn't need to speak constantly to know what the other was thinking. Lirithia glanced at Jake, his face set in a determined expression, his eyes focused ahead. There was something reassuring in his presence, a quiet strength that she hadn't realized she needed until now. She had always been strong on her own, but it was different with Jake. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. "Jake," Lyrathia said softly, her voice breaking the silence. He turned to look at her, a question in his eyes. "What happens after we find shelter? Where do we go from here?" Jake's expression softened as he looked at her, the worry lines on his forehead fading slightly. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, his voice calm. "But we'll figure it out. We'll find a way, one step at a time." Lyrathia nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief at his words. It was the first time in a while that she had heard someone speak with such certainty, not because they had all the answers, but because they were willing to face the uncertainty together. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered, almost to herself. Jake's eyes softened at her words, his lips curling into a small smile. "I'm glad I'm here too." They continued walking in silence, but this time, there was a sense of mutual understanding, an unspoken promise between them. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, the light fading rapidly as the cold seemed to seep deeper into the air. They had to keep moving. Lyrathia's muscles were aching, but she pushed forward, each step bringing her closer to something, though she wasn't sure what. The unknown was still there, but so was Jake, and that was enough to keep her going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they spotted a faint outline in the distance, something that looked like a building. It was barely visible against the endless expanse of snow and ice, but it was there. "Shelter," Jake muttered, a note of relief in his voice. Lyrathia's heart quickened as they picked up their pace, the promise of warmth and safety drawing them forward. As they neared the building, Jake pushed open a heavy door, and the warmth of the interior hit them like a wave. They were finally inside, finally safe. Lyrathia let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "We made it," she said, her voice tired but full of gratitude. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "For now," he said, "but we're not done yet. We need to rest, but we also need to stay vigilant. The journey's not over." Lyrathia didn't argue. She knew he was right. They had made it this far, but the unknown still loomed ahead. Still, she felt something different now, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. She smiled, a small, quiet smile. "We'll make it," she said, her voice steady. Jake turned to look at her, his smile matching hers. "Together," he said, and for the first time, Lyrathia truly believed it. The warmth of the shelter was a welcome relief, but the quiet also gave rise to the reality of their situation. Jake sat by the small, flickering fire they managed to start, watching the flames dance and crackle. Lyrathia was across from him, her back leaning against the wall, staring at the fire. She had been quiet for a while now, lost in thought. Jake understood. They had come a long way, and yet, there was still so much ahead of them. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a moment to catch their breath. The silence was comfortable. Lyrathia had always been someone who preferred solitude, but with Jake, it didn't feel uncomfortable. She looked at him, the soft glow of the fire casting a warm light on his face. "You've been through a lot," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. Jake glanced over at her, meeting her gaze. "We've both been through a lot," he replied, his voice calm. "It's not just me. You've survived just as much." Lyrathia nodded, her expression unreadable. "I used to think I was alone in all of this," she said, almost to herself. "That I had to carry the weight of everything on my own." She paused, her eyes shifting away, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "But now, I don't know." Jake's gaze softened. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," he said. "We're in this together, remember?" Lyrathia's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had spent so much of her life guarding herself from the world, refusing to trust anyone, but with Jake, everything was different. She felt a warmth spread across her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite describe, but one that felt like it was just what she needed. She met his eyes again, and this time, she didn't look away. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being here." Jake smiled, a soft, understanding smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." The promise in his voice was reassuring, and for the first time in a long time, Lyrathia felt like she could trust someone again. She didn't have to be alone in this world. She had Jake now. The thought brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in ages. As the fire continued to crackle, the two sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of their journey hanging in the air, but somehow, it didn't feel as heavy as before. They had each other, and that was enough for now. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within Lirithia's heart was far from over. She still had a lot to work through, a lot to overcome, but with Jake by her side, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could make it through. Together, they would face whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but it didn't seem so frightening anymore. The days seemed to blur together as Jake and Lirithia continued their journey through the alien world. The harsh terrain stretched out endlessly before them, a vast expanse of icy plains and rocky outcrops. The shelter they had found was a temporary haven, but it wasn't enough to keep them from the dangers of the wild. Lirithia had never felt more out of place, and yet, with Jake by her side, the weight of the world didn't feel so heavy. The storm had passed, but the cold remained, a constant reminder of how fragile their survival was. Despite the desolate landscape, there was a strange sense of camaraderie between them, an unspoken bond that had grown stronger with every step they took together. They had learned to rely on each other, to trust each other, in ways that neither had expected when they first met. "Do you think we'll ever get back?" Lirithia asked one evening, her voice soft but filled with a quiet uncertainty. She was looking out at the endless snow, her thoughts drifting far away, to a place she once called home. Jake looked over at her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But we'll keep going, one step at a time. That's all we can do." His words were simple, but there was a sense of calm in them that made Lirithia feel a little lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. The journey was uncertain, but as long as Jake was with her, she felt like she could face whatever came their way. The days passed, and the two of them settled into a routine, moving from one shelter to the next as the world around them remained as unforgiving as ever. The alien landscape had become both a challenge and a comfort. It was harsh, but it was their reality now, and they had no choice but to adapt. One day, as they were trekking across a particularly difficult stretch of land, Lirithia stumbled, her foot slipping on the ice. Without thinking, Jake reached out, steadying her with one hand. "Careful," he said gently, his grip firm but kind. Lirithia looked up at him, surprised by the concern in his voice. "Thanks," she murmured, her cheeks flushing slightly. She hadn't realized how much she had come to depend on him until that moment. She had always been strong, always pushed through everything on her own, but now, with Jake by her side, she didn't have to do everything alone. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. She wasn't used to needing someone else, but she found that, with Jake, it didn't feel like a weakness. It felt like strength. They continued on, the icy winds biting at their faces as they made their way across the desolate plains. But Lirithia didn't mind the cold anymore. She didn't mind the isolation, because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. She had Jake, and that, she realized, was enough. They kept moving forward, step by step, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. And as they walked side by side, the world seemed a little less intimidating, a little more hopeful. The journey was far from over, but Lirithia knew, deep down, that with Jake at her side, they would find a way to survive, to adapt, and to thrive, no matter how impossible it seemed. The cold wind howled outside, but inside the shelter, it felt like a world apart. The warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the small space where Jake and Lirithia sat. It had been a long day, the trek through the harsh landscape a constant reminder of the struggle they were facing. But as they sat there, side by side, there was a quiet sense of peace between them. Lirithia had never imagined she would find herself in a place like this, surrounded by the remnants of a civilization that had long since crumbled, and yet, she didn't feel entirely out of place. Not with Jake beside her. She glanced at him, his profile softened by the flickering firelight. He was staring into the flames, deep in thought, as if lost in his own world. She wanted to ask him what was on his mind, but she didn't want to disturb the calm between them. She had always been the one to carry the weight of her thoughts, her fears, and her worries. But lately, with Jake, it felt like she didn't have to bear it all alone anymore. "Jake," she said softly, breaking the silence. He turned to look at her, his expression warm but curious. "What's next for us?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. He smiled gently, his eyes meeting hers. We keep going, he said simply. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. Lirathia felt a flicker of something in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She wasn't used to having someone else's reassurance, but with Jake, it felt different. It wasn't about promises or grand plans. It was about the quiet certainty that they would face whatever came next together. You've got a lot of faith in me, she said, a slight smile tugging at her lips. Jake chuckled, the sound light and easy. It's not just faith, he replied, his tone teasing yet sincere. I trust you. We're in this together, remember? His words settled over her like a blanket of warmth. She had always been so used to being self-reliant, to standing on her own 2 feet. But with Jake, it felt like maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the world on her shoulders anymore. The realization was both freeing and terrifying. I don't know what I'd do without you, Lirathia admitted, her voice soft. You don't have to worry about that, Jake said, his voice steady. You won't have to do anything alone again. Lirathia nodded, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar sense of gratitude. She had never allowed herself to depend on anyone before, but with Jake, it felt like the right thing to do. She didn't have to be strong all the time. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of her own vulnerability and didn't feel ashamed. They stayed silent for a moment, the crackling fire filling the space between them. Outside, the storm had died down, but the cold lingered. Inside, though, there was warmth, both from the fire and from the unspoken connection between them. The future was still uncertain, the path ahead unclear, but in that moment, with Jake by her side, Lirathia realized that the unknown didn't seem so daunting anymore. They would face it together. And that was enough.